Providing counseling for members of the Canadian Armed Forces, for veterans, for first responders, and their families must begin with a sense of curiosity about their lived experience, about their culture, their values, their norms. Now, why is that important for moving forward family services? We might very well see clients who were first responders to the wildfires in BC. We might meet with refugees who come from countries where military service is mandatory, or they might have trauma from experiences they had in their country before they came to Canada. With the Canadian Armed Forces, Canada has a very westernized, individualistic view, and yet the culture in the Canadian Armed Forces is almost a collectivist culture because of the way it's built, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So how do we know where to start? One approach to take is to look at their socioeconomic status and understand more where they're coming from. For some individuals, military service is ingrained in their family. They have that service record that goes from generation to generation to generation, and they know what their path is. And they know that they're dedicated to service. So it becomes service above self. That's essential, right? The other possibility, the other end of the spectrum, is somebody who comes from a community like in the Maritimes where fishing used to be very lucrative and now maybe it's not. So they're looking for another career path, and this becomes the best next choice. That can mean that individuals who've never driven a car before suddenly are learning how to drive a tank in the middle of a city street. There's a lot of different ranges of socioeconomic status within the military itself. So it's important not just to see the uniform, but to see the person behind the uniform. One of the expressions that you hear in the military community is that you knew what you signed up for. But did you really? Every career is different. You can't predict what's going to happen. Nobody knew September 11th was going to happen. Part of the goal is that you join the career fully prepared to be engaged, but you don't know what that looks like. Some trades get utilized frequently, some don't. Depends on your career. Some ranks end up being used more than others, in that an officer will typically have 1 or 2 deployments for their whole career of 25 years, whereas a non-commissioned officer or an enlisted personnel might deploy 4 or 5 times. When Canada chose to send tanks to Afghanistan in 2006, only 1 regiment in Canada had tanks. And that regiment should have been 500 people at full capacity. They were 350. And that meant that every time someone was in Afghanistan with tanks, it was that regiment. They had 3 cycles where either you were there right now, or you were preparing to go, or you just came back, and they cycled through. There are soldiers who had 4 or 5 deployments overseas. It depends on your rank. It depends on your trade. It depends on your position. Other regiments that had 2,000 people, you might get lucky to go once. And I say it that way, you might get lucky because they're there to serve. That's their purpose. That's why they're there. If you don't get to go, there's that letdown because you weren't allowed to participate. Another expression that's common in the military community is the hurry up and wait. So hurry up and wait means that everybody has to be prepared to go. If you think something's going to happen, you have to make sure everybody has the training they need, that they're prepared to go, they're ready to go. So there's kind of a stoplight that you look at. You can either DAG red, green, or yellow. When you DAG red, that means that you're not deployable right now. There's something going on in your life that prevents you from being used. If you DAG yellow, it means there's some warning signs there. Maybe you can deal with it and resolve it and still be deployed. Maybe you can't. Or you DAG green. Green means you're good to go from the military perspective. Okay. There are a lot of other things to think about. One of the unfortunate truths is that the guys who had this most stable relationship, or women in the forces who had the most stable relationship at home, a supportive spouse, sometimes kids, sometimes not, they are the best prepared to go overseas on deployments because they're the best grounded individuals. That means that there's more pressure because that family is left behind. So 1 or 2 things can happen. When they get ready to go, it's very common, it's almost expected, that that couple's going to fight before they leave. Because it is much easier to leave somebody that you hate than somebody that you are deeply in love with. There's the emotional baggage of separating from somebody who you're really, really in love with. So you end up fighting right before they go. And then there's that 1 month window. In that 1 month, the soldier is totally focused on what they're supposed to be doing when they get over there, all the unknowns, all the anticipation, all the excitement, all the stress is all focused on their future responsibilities. At home, there's that loss. There's that person that's really important. There's different ways to deal with that loss, but still it's a loss. Usually by the 1 month mark, things flatten out. So the soldier now knows all the expectations. There's no unknowns where they are. It's all become boring. Now, boring means on most deployments, there's a 90%, 10%. So 90% of the time you're bored. There's nothing happening. And then in 10% of the time, it becomes intense. Something happens that triggers everything. Okay? And then you go back to that 90. So it's a constant. You're always waiting. Whereas at home, you find a new routine. You learn to live without the person at home all the time. You end up taking on the responsibilities that the spouse used to take on. You find a new way of having a reasonable life. Now, the catch-22 is that when the service member comes back, if the family has been independent enough without the person in their life day to day, then that person feels threatened, right? Because they're worried they're not needed anymore. But if the family can't adapt and cope to the partner being away because of deployment, then they don't make it, then they don't stay married. So you need to find that balance where both sides feel validated, and it's tricky. That's one of the reasons why there's a lot of unknowns when deployments happen. One thing that happened in Canada in 2002 was the first combat deployment in 50 years since the Korean War. Nobody was prepared for that at that time. There are guys who were wanting to be involved, who were waiting for active service because that was their purpose. They were there to do something. They were ready. They were prepared to go, but they weren't prepared to go because it hadn't been combat for 50 years. There were a lot of unknowns. When they got over there and things got nasty, when the friendly fire incident happened, for example, they didn't have a chance to process their emotions. They were a very small battle group. I think there were 850 soldiers who went in 2002. That means that there were not that many people there for extras. You were fully engaged when you were there. Very few chances to stand down, to catch your breath. If something critical happens, you have to focus on operational effectiveness. You have to focus on getting the mission done. You cannot take time to grieve. You can't take time to be sad or upset because that prevents the operation from going forward. You have to put those emotions aside and focus on the task at hand, and you get it done. Or you don't. And if you don't, you end up in trouble, right? Because you can't stay and not be actively involved. You'll end up being in trouble. If you're going to be able to do it right, you have to put those emotions aside and wait until you come home. Now, when you come home, it's established fact that after the first deployment, it'll take 3 months for you to cycle back into a normal routine. After the second deployment, it takes about 6 months for a soldier to come back from deployment and reintegrate into society, into their family. After the third deployment, it takes a year. And like I said, there were some people who deployed 4 or 5 times. So the emotional impact of that is pretty intense. The struggles they face when they come home are common, but they feel isolating. So when they have unprocessed emotions, they can come home and they can keep going forward because they've got that community of support in the military environment. Their peers help them through it, and they manage to navigate it in most cases, in some cases, or they don't. When they don't, then there's that sense of shame because they're not fully functioning in that community anymore. And being part of a collective mentality is that if you're not a contributing member, what value do you have? You might end up being able to get through it because of that community that you're part of. They might help you deal with the emotions just by being still partly supported by the community. If you're not, then you end up falling apart. Right? You could process those emotions this month, next month, in 10 years. It depends on the individual, depends on what brings it up. It's also important to know that if you talk to somebody who is dealing with issues or concerns or whatever the crisis is right now that brought them to counseling right now, and you hear enough information to assume that PTSD might be one of the playing factors here. PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, if you know a little bit about it, you might assume that that's what's happening, and that's from the combat. That's from when they were on deployment. That has to be when that's from. That may or may not be true. It's possible because these are still members of Canadian society. it's possible that that PTSD is coming from childhood ACEs. Childhood ACEs means adverse childhood experiences. So maybe what happened when they were deployed just brought them back to when they had those adverse childhood experiences. And that's where the trauma really is. If you don't open your mind to understand what exactly is going on for that client at that time, you're going to miss things. So it's important to understand that part too, that they're people with complex lives like everybody else. Another factor with military deployments now is that there's invisible and visible injuries. So in previous combat operations, it was unlikely people would come back wounded the way they do now because they didn't have the protective armor to keep them alive. At this point now, more soldiers are coming back statistically than previous wars because they survive what goes on, but they come back with invisible wounds that are really hard to identify. And they're hard for them to admit that they have a problem because of that stigma. So stigma, let's talk a little bit about that. When they're deployed and something happens, they have to rely on the efficiency of the operation. They have to rely on the hierarchy of command. They have to have trust in that hierarchy of command because they know they're all there for a purpose. And if they all do a job, if I do my job and you do your job, it's going to be successful, right? If you get an order from somebody above you that doesn't match your own personal values, your own moral code, you have choices. If you follow those orders because that's the line of command, you can end up really feeling like you violated your own moral code. And that can lead to a sense of guilt and shame. So guilt would be something bad happened. That was a bad event. Shame would be taking it to the next level and saying that I'm a bad person because I was part of that bad event. Guilt and shame are a really big part of working with military clients to get a sense of what brought them here today. Another comment that's made sometimes in military communities is that the guys who didn't get off the boat are the ones who joined the Legion. That's the Second World War reference of guys who got to England, were ready to go, but never actually got off the boat to hit the land in France. They have that sense of community because they remember all of that positive energy of being connected to something that was higher than themselves, of being a common purpose, a common goal. But they don't have the baggage that comes with it from being in the traumatic events that hit the guys who were on the ground in the land. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just that getting a sense from your client about where their experiences were will help you identify what happened to them. What did they get involved with? What brought them here today? And I keep saying that because often with military clients, you're looking at PTSD and you're saying, I know PTSD, CBT is the perfect intervention. If cognitive behavioral therapy is the gold standard of treatment for PTSD, that's where I'm going to go as an intern or counselor. That might not work. PTSD with a general population is potentially different than PTSD with a military client. A lot of military clients don't want to unpack things with CBT because that talks about your feelings, and that's not where they want to go often. You need to understand from your client what they need, what they want. So it could be instead, for example, if they come in with a problem, you can find out what made them come in today, what's different today from yesterday, and what do you want to get out of counseling? If they want to fix the problem they've got right now and not unpack everything they went through when they were deployed, find something like solution-focused brief therapy that might be more effective with that population so they can find a way to deal with the problem they have today and get some tools in their toolkit to move forward and take care of themselves the next time something comes up. You might not know the outcome and you might not feel like that was the best intervention, but if that's what the client needs, that's what we do. There's also family issues with military clients, partly because you're looking at people who are married or have kids or don't have kids. Understanding what the family is going through is very important. So for spouses, some of them have actual professional careers, they're nurses, they're teachers, they're other things. If they can't keep a consistent job, then they've given up a lot of their own personal identity and their own career aspirations because they're now following the career of their husband. It's important to know what that wife gave up. It's important to know what the sacrifices were that were necessary to make the military career possible. And that's really important to consider with kids as well, and understanding what that child has experienced. There's an understanding that you don't make the child responsible for replacing the husband or the mother when they go, because you can't say you're now the man of the family, you take care of it when I'm gone. That's way too much pressure. It's understood in most communities, it's understood that is not the right way to go. But there's other things that happen that are uncontrollable. For example, if a child sees that their friend next door, if that dad didn't come back from deployment because he was killed overseas, what's going to happen when that kid's father prepares to redeploy? There are a lot of things to understand about military culture that are unique to the culture that are important to understand to be successful with that client. Other topics that come up are things like suicide. Suicide among veterans and military personnel is a much higher percentage of the population than it is with the general population in Canada. There's reasons for that. Understanding, if you have a military client, find out if they have thoughts of suicide, and don't be blunt. Please be blunt. Don't try to be gentle. Say, are you thinking of killing yourself? If you don't own it, if you don't ask that question directly, it's very unlikely they'll respond. But if you do ask that question and you are open and you're willing to have a conversation, you open the door to hopefully keeping them safe. So do that suicide risk assessment in the first session. Don't be afraid to revisit it again if you feel like maybe there's a sense that maybe they're at risk of hurting themselves or harming somebody else. Having that conversation might save a life. If you're uncomfortable with it, practice. Find a peer and practice, because it's important that you can do that naturally so that they understand that you are there to have that hard conversation if that's really going on. And you won't regret it if it turns out to be true. You can help them through that and keep them safe for now and find resources to keep them safe going forward. The other thing that happens with military clients, often there's unresolved grief. And that unresolved grief can bring them to counseling next week, could come in a couple of years, could come later on, much later on, when they start to recognize that they need help and come and want to talk about things that they haven't processed yet. So understanding suicide, understanding grief and loss, understanding solution-focused brief therapy, you need to understand that working with these clients, with these kind of populations where it's collectivist, where there's a mentality that they're in together, when things don't work properly or things don't flow the way they hope they will, or things happen that are outside of their control, knowing the kinds of things that you can do to help them through that in the moment are really important. So being present for these clients is so essential, giving them a safe place to come where they feel like they can be heard and they're understood and they're not judged. It's especially important with this group because they're so distinct from other populations in Canada. If you can find a way to engage with them, if you can meet them where they're at, that's a gift. These are people who served so that we could live the life we live. We have a responsibility with social justice. We have a responsibility, just a compassionate human being, to help those people now that they're back. So thank you.